Welcome, everyone. My name is Piper Hendricks, and I'm the CEO of Stories Change Power, and we're so glad that you're here this Friday. If you've attended our webinars before, you know that we like to start with a song that brings some energy. And if you like that little bop right now, I'm so glad. I also want to mention that Lisa, one of our speakers today, suggested Tell Me Something Good by Rufus and Shaka Khan. So if you are needing a good song to lead into your weekend, I plant that idea now. Both songs are appropriate though, because we are about to tell you something good, actually, a lot of things good about teamwork. And first, I want to share that these monthly webinars are just one way that we equip people to take an effect. Sorry, let me get my Friday brain online. That we equip people to lead effective and rewarding approaches and even careers in advocacy communications. We will share a link to other opportunities and ways to stay in touch at the end of the webinar. But right now, I want to dive in. I'll start by thanking Rebecca Messer for her tech support. She is the reason that you see things magically popping into the chat and all of the videos that start us off. So thank you, Rebecca, for that. We will be keeping the chat open for constructive conversation. If you've got questions, please put those in the Q&A. There should be a box at the bottom of your screen. We welcome questions anytime. And if we're not able to reach them all today, then we'll address those in an upcoming newsletter or on LinkedIn. 4 quick reminders before we jump in. Remember, you are off camera, so take care of you. Stretch if you need, hydrate, eat lunch or breakfast, depending on your time zone. Also, we've got closed captions enabled, so please use those if they're helpful to you. Third, if you have any tech difficulties or need to step away, don't worry. We will share the recording and you'll find that on YouTube later. Also, last and definitely not least, as always, there is a lot competing for our focus today. I encourage you to give yourself the gift of being fully present. Our speakers have so much wonderful information to share. So really tune in and be present in this conversation. There are 5 key things I want to share about our approach at Stories Change Power. We are people-centered, data-informed, research-backed, bridge building, and organization-wide. And today I am delighted to be joined by 2 speakers who will take on 2 issues at once, including that 5th component of our programming being organization-wide. They will talk about how, a lot of people can be daunted by media engagement, finding reporters and talking with journalists. They're going to share a bit about how to do that. And then secondly, when we hear about organizations that work in silos, that is not a good approach to advocacy communications. So I am excited to welcome both Dafina Williams and Lisa Chensvold to share these 2 topics, talking about media and teamwork together. Dafina is the Executive Vice President of many titles, Executive Vice President, Chief Public Policy Officer, and Head of Government Affairs at the Opportunity Finance Network, or OFN. Dafina drives OFN's efforts in public policy, legislative affairs, and regulatory initiatives. She's been at OFN for many years, and before her current position, she played a pivotal role in shaping the organization's policy agenda, concentrating on federal appropriations, small business policy, and fair lending practices. Lisa is OFN's Senior Vice President of Strategic Communications. She joined OFN in 2022 and brought more than 15 years of experience working in communications and marketing at nonprofits focused on equity and opportunity. Lisa drives OFN's communications and public relations, particularly brand narrative and reputation, media, and thought leadership. Welcome, Dafina and Lisa. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yes, thank you. I'm excited for this conversation.
We are so glad to have you here. And I want to give us a sense of who's on the call. We're going to pop up a poll here. So everybody take a look at your screen. If there should be two questions popping up. You can also answer these in the chat if you prefer. But we're wanting to know, how long have you worked in the field of communications? And you'll see several options there. And if you're not in communications, that last spot is for you. But let us know, have you been in the field for less than 2 years, a few years? I see some responses coming in. And then our second question, and this one is multiple choice, so pick as many as you like. What words would you describe how you feel about thinking about media engagement? And we've got the options are scared, excited, eager to learn, exhausted, or fully prepared? So I see a lot of good responses coming in. We'll give a few more seconds and then let's go ahead. Like 3, 2, 1, pop in those answers and we'll share the results here for folks to see. A couple folks who are new, a couple who have been here a good long while a good while, 3 to 7 years, good long while, several pros, and then a couple folks who are not in the field of communication. So welcome. All of these topics are of interest, even if this is not your full-time job. On the media engagement, I'm seeing a couple folks who are a little scared, more folks who are excited, many folks eager to learn, which is great, about half who are exhausted, and one fully prepared. So welcome to everybody. And that's really helpful to us to know who is here. And with that, Lisa and Dafina, I'd like to turn it over to you to share a story of the Community Reinvestment Act and dig into how you're collaborating in this space.
Great. And I will get us started and try to weave in a little bit about CDFIs and what we are and what we do as we're kind of going through this story. So the Community Reinvestment Act, for many of you who might not be familiar, is an anti-redlining law that requires banks to reinvest in communities. And they can choose to do this directly or with partners. And over the years, banks have turned to community lenders like CDFIs to help drive investment in communities. It's oftentimes easier for them to work with partners like CDFIs that have experience on the ground instead of deploying that capital themselves for a variety of reasons. So it's a really important law that was passed in the late 70s. And over time, it really didn't adjust and change to meet the realities of the financial services landscape. And so the last major updates to this law and the regulations were in 1995. And so in the late 2010s, 2017, 2018, there was sort of a groundswell of energy to actually put forth some real effort into reforming the CRA to make sure that it could capture things like, changes in banking patterns and online banking and fintech and just all the changes that we've seen in the financial services landscape. And so at OFN and within our network, CRA is a really important part of our work. We actually get more than half of our borrowed capital comes from banks that are motivated by their Community Reinvestment Act performance exams. And so any changes and updates to the regulations and to how that law were implemented have a direct impact on us and how we do our work. So we were very, very interested in what those changes and those reforms were going to look like. So we actually engaged with our network and a lot of key partners for a period of about 5 or 6 years on different iterations of reform proposals that were put forth by the major federal bank regulators, the Comptroller of the Currency, the Federal Reserve, and the FDIC. And in 2023, we were really excited because a final rule came forward that was leaps and bounds better than what we had been in place for the previous 30 years, was really going to open up a lot more opportunities for investment to come into CDFIs and to the communities that we serve. And we had put a lot of effort into it. We had been writing comment letters. We had been going on the Hill and talking to members of Congress about what the changes might mean for them and their communities. We have been actually working with some of our bank partners and through different coalitions, and really thought that the regulators actually landed in a really positive position that was going to drive the industry forward. And so we were really pleased with where the rule landed. There was a lot of good stuff in there for CDFIs. We actually put a webinar on with the vice chair of the Federal Reserve to kind of share out what the changes mean for our network and our organization. And we're, happy to promote all of those things. And then in February of this year, there was a lawsuit filed by the Texas Bankers Association and a couple of local chambers of commerce to actually stop the implementation of the rule. And I think we were both, very kind of shocked by this kind of legal effort to put a stop on a big effort that the banks had actually been a part of. They had actually worked alongside us to put forth their ideas and their thoughts into the reforms. And now they were basically saying, we think that, where these regulators ended up was beyond the scope of what this rule is supposed to look like. And it's too onerous, it's too expensive, it's too burdensome. We think you should prevent the regulators from actually implementing it. And so we had a decision to make in that moment because, again, we had staked a lot of our time and energy and reputation on these reform efforts. We had been very vocal about our support for the reforms. And we, were incredibly disappointed to see this lawsuit kind of stop that progress. At the same time, the very banks that were kind of putting forth that lawsuit and working within the American Bankers Association and the Texas Bankers Association were our partners. They were people that we worked with a lot. They're people that were investors in OFN. And so we know that, coming out and taking a strong position against the lawsuit didn't come without a lot of risks to us, potentially to our investments and to our portfolio and our bottom line. And so we had a decision to make. I, from my perch, kind of thought it was really important to immediately inform the rest of our executive leadership team about what was happening. And so, sort of went through, read the filings, the court filings, tried to understand exactly what the arguments were that were being made, wrote a memo, circulated it, and said, hey, here's what's happening, here's how it might impact us, and here's some things I think we should do. And one of them was for us to actually put out our own kind of statement around, our position on it. So I want to toss it over to Lisa, because this is kind of when the communications team, jumped in and said, okay, we need to say something, but how do we actually figure out what the right tone is and what's the right approach and what would that statement would look like? And Lisa and her team really kind of led that effort.
Thanks, Dafina. Yeah, so this was, for everything that Dafina laid out, this was an unfortunate development, but it was something we needed to say something about. And let me just say, this is also in a broader context of an environment where we have seen more lawsuits that kind of target what our organization does and what our industry does, right? Starting with the fall of affirmative action, these other lawsuits against race-conscious programs and calling them discriminatory themselves and unconstitutional. So we're kind of in this mix of this trend. And we had been watching this trend very carefully and trying to figure out when and where to weigh in, because we have, in fact, members of our network who were party to such lawsuits. And in the theory of, and the principle of first do no harm, we didn't want to get out there and say something that would come back to bite us, to be fair, and to harm our industry and any of our members. So, but this development, which was in that mix, felt like this is a core regulation for our industry, and we needed to say something. And so luckily we have really good lines of communication, and between the executive team and the policy team, we got up to speed on what happened and how this affects what we had been working toward for quite some time. And so we worked together with, our CEO and with our chief of staff to really sketch out a tone, to pull it back, to lean in. And we really struck a fine balance, but we needed to say something, right? You've seen people put out just mealy-mouthed statements that don't say anything. We really did need to say something, but really be somewhat measured about that. And we chose to put out a statement because we could craft our single message, and we could have that stand on its own rather than a big PR push or a media push. So we knew it was out there and it could get attention, but it was, we controlled the statement. So it was a standalone statement. And then I'll let Dafina talk about what that statement helped us do.
Yeah. And I think the timing of when we actually put that statement out was also really key, because I said the lawsuit was in early February, and there was actually a major community investment conference taking place right in early March, where all of the regulators, lots of bankers, and lots of community groups all gathered in Portland to talk about the Community Reinvestment Act, to talk about trends and, what was happening in this community development finance field. And so we actually put our statement out, I think, maybe a week or so before that conference, and, went into that event actually, kind of not knowing what the reaction would be, again, because there's sort of those three different audiences there that all have an interest in what OFN has to say about this. And I think a couple of things happened. One is that we received enormous positive feedback and thanks directly from the regulators. They actually had a sidebar meeting at this conference where, they thanked OFN for really stepping out and putting out a strong statement where we expressed our disappointment. We literally put that in our statement that we are extremely disappointed with the entities that brought the case. And as Lisa noted, other organizations had sort of maybe tap danced around it a little bit. They were saying things, but they weren't really coming out and saying, we think this is a bad idea and we disagree. And the regulators were really appreciative of us because of our connection to this work and to the CRA itself, that our voice actually was really meaningful in this conversation. And, we're really encouraged to see that OFN was taking a strong stance and really supporting all the work that they had put into, reforming the Community Reinvestment Act. And we're taking kind of a strong position that not many of our other partners at that time were doing. And so those are the types of things where we are leveraging, our platform to, make a strong stance on something we feel is really important to our industry, but it actually had lots of other different impacts because it really strengthened our relationships with, the federal banking regulators. And now, they've continued to kind of reach out and call on us as partners and, kind of give us access to additional information and, kind of say, hey, like we want OFN to be a part of this conversation and we want to make sure that we're hearing from you, because they know that we're kind of a trusted partner that's rowing in the same direction with them on some of these policy issues. So that's just one example of something that happened that, it was a policy initiative that, really kind of took a wrong turn in our opinion. And we really felt like we needed to step up and say something. And again, we didn't get a ton of like people, I think, picking up the statement, and we didn't get a ton of like national press of it, but it had other really useful, positive benefits. And we also were able to leverage that statement and share it out into different audiences. So sent it to our to other folks on the Hill that we know are interested in this conversation, sent it to other partners. We could point our members to it as well. So when they were looking for information about what was happening and what's OFN's position, we had something ready that we could actually say, hey, we've actually, been out on record, expressing how we feel about this.
There's so much in that I really want to underscore for listeners, especially I think when folks are new to advocacy, some of this may come as a surprise. And number one, advocacy is never linear, right? I mean, it sounds like you had made great progress, and it's tempting to think, we've done it, we've fixed it, and now it's just a matter of implementation. And you never know when something comes up, something will be undone. And so really being ready at any moment for those shifts along the way. I admire how intentional you were about collaborating across the organization and recognizing when people were looking to your voice. I think it's tempting for some organizations to want to weigh in on everything all the time, and that can be a bad use of resources. It also risks that then you're not weighing in inadvertently on areas where people may see inconsistency, but knowing where folks are looking to you for your voice and to be very clear, not mealy mouthed, as you said, Lisa, like we are disappointed. And it sounds like also, though, you're really focused on the policy, and we see a lot of this in the current environment where it may be tempting to say, oh, these entities, these people, and name call, but you focused on this is the policy. We're not casting, aspersions at people who are behind this, but looking at, here's the policy. And then last thing, I feel like I could go on, but I just, last thing I really want to highlight for folks is how it can be tempting to think, we want to shout things from the rooftop and have everybody hear them. We know that our audiences are never everybody. And so you were very focused in who needs to read the statement, who needs to have it, and then have that language live on. So is there anything I missed in there? Just lots of great lessons.
I just want to highlight, given the topic of this webinar, which is that we weren't really focused on media in this. We wanted to have a statement out there, and for all the reasons Dafina outlined, be able to point people to it, be able to say, this is clearly where OFN is on this decision. But a big media push, sometimes you lose control of it. And our statement, as well crafted as a partnership between policy and comms, could stand for itself and not take the conversation in a direction that we might not have wanted it to go. We could use it very strategically and tactically for our aims.
Absolutely. And I just one minor thing, but it was felt really good to be able to bring back that positive feedback to the communications team, because I think a lot of times our comms teams, they're working behind the scenes, they're not necessarily getting a ton of credit for all the work that they're putting in, and not necessarily hearing a lot of good back about how it's being received. And so it was really nice to be able to say, hey, this statement landed really well with a really key audience for us, and they were very appreciative, and they thank you for your good work, and I want to make sure that you all know that. So it's just those small things that really build the working relationship between our two teams, which is like a mutual respect for our expertise and the things that we each can bring to the table, and it does give you just a better combined product at the end.
Yeah. Yeah. That appreciation goes a long way. It takes a
Mhm.
moment, but lasts a long time. To your point, Lisa, I mean, this was an example of not needing to do a great amount of media engagement, but I'd love to take a step back and just take a look at the larger media landscape, especially for folks who may not be as familiar with what that looks like right now.
Sure. I I don't want to discourage anybody on this call, but it's tough. It's tough out there. It's changed a lot. I'm sure that folks are aware of media consolidation and the drastic cutting of various newsrooms, particularly in local and regional media, just drastic cuts. So, when you're thinking about a media engagement and cultivating relationships with reporters, you know, you're looking at demographically probably somebody who's 27 or 28 years old, more women than men, except in sports and other kinds of beats that you might have where they're traditionally male dominated, still fairly white dominated, although that is changing. And especially if you're trying to pitch a state story or a local story, that person might have, 3 or 4 beats that they're covering. And so they're trying to file their stories and trying to keep track of a whole landscape that they might just understand a little sliver of. And so when you come into media, you need to really think about the power that you have, because you are an expert and and you can help them tell the right story. And so I think a lot of times we come into media engagements feeling scared that you could say the wrong thing, or you're going to get yourself in a trap, get quoted for eternity for something. Yes, that is possible. But if you step into it knowing you are there to help the reporter get their story right. But within that, look, we're competing with more content than ever, but harder and harder to get content and stories placed out there. A lot more in the media landscape these days, particularly, I'm talking mostly about print, less about television or even radio. But so much more is pay to play, right? So much more sponsored content. You want to get something in Forbes, you sponsor an article, et cetera. So I think we'll talk about that a little later about how the different media platforms work together in terms of paid opportunities, but it's just getting tougher and tougher to get the attention. We all know, you all know, you might be on this call trying to keep your attention. It is tough, but there are some specific strategies, and I can get into those now or in a little bit, but how you really want to focus and hone in given that crowded and noisy landscape.
Yeah, no, and I encourage folks use the Q&A, because we will loop back to the peso model, but I do want to hear if there's particular questions around media engagement. Dafina, you, I think, are in a fairly unique role in that you'd started in communications with OFN and then moved over to policy. And so you have a neat perspective on how media has changed, including awareness about your issue. Can you share a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been at OFN for just since 2006, so quite a long time, and have seen dramatic changes in the awareness and understanding of this industry and our ability to kind of get access to, media and to get that sort of attention. So I think community lenders have been on the ground addressing issues and crisis, like, working to help keep people in their homes during the foreclosure crisis, and doing a lot to save small businesses in 2008 through 2010. helping disaster recovery in like New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina and then after Superstorm Sandy in the Northeast. And we're still kind of this like best kept secret, which, it sounds cute, but it's really not that useful when you're actually trying to build momentum to get people to understand our work, to get more investors to understand our work, and to really highlight all the great things that our network and our partners are doing on the ground. So, people just didn't really know what CDFIs are, what they did. They didn't know what the acronym meant. And, we were just not getting a ton of media attention for the work that we were doing. There might be like occasional one-off stories of a particular individual institution or something that's happening in the community. But by and large, you were not seeing, the term CDFI show up in the Wall Street Journal or in the New York Times. But we were well known by our partners and institutions, like, the Treasury Department certainly knows what CDFIs are, and the banks that work with us do, but the general public really didn't have that level of understanding and awareness. And so I really started to see that change during the pandemic. And I think there are a couple of things that happened there that really kind of blew up, the profile of the CDFI industry. The first one is the failed launch of the Paycheck Protection Program. So when those first couple of rounds just entirely missed the smallest businesses owned by people of color, businesses in low-income areas, that became a big, 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 big media story in March, April 2020. Reporters were really interested in why big banks were not reaching those customers. And then they started to really go down to that next layer a little bit in a way we hadn't seen before, which is, okay, are there institutions that are better suited to meet these businesses' needs? And if so, kind of who are they? And how do we kind of understand what's happening, what's keeping them out of this program and not being able to access the platforms and being able to deploy that resource to their borrowers? So, why are both the customers and the lenders being shut out of this gigantic program that's supposed to save America's small businesses? So that was one really important piece that, started to kind of build momentum to get more interest and awareness around CDFIs. And then the other thing that happened was the murder of George Floyd and the major attention that also continues to come to what was happening with the lack of investment and support for Black communities and small businesses in particular. And then once again, CDFIs were kind of right at the forefront as a solution to a lot of these kind of large structural societal problems that we were addressing. And so that was another way where we started to kind of get media attention, which is like, actually, these are the same institutions are working to address both of those problems. And people were really starting to make those connections that say, okay, like, what are these CDFI, who are they? And we started to really get those inquiries coming in from Bloomberg, CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. We're getting interview requests from all the major outlets, and they wanted to understand more and more about what CDFIs are and what we do and how we can help address some of these issues. And that was when the media interest where I really started to kind of take off. And I think the great thing about this story is it wasn't just that we were getting attention in the national press, outside of like kind of our traditional trade industry press that, American Banker and Shelter Force, which are important, of course, but we weren't getting that mainstream attention in the same way like we started to get during the pandemic. But it also helped result in big policy changes too. It actually caught the attention of folks on Capitol Hill that were writing legislation, and of the Vice President Kamala Harris became a big, big, big supporter of the CDFI industry. And all of a sudden, we're seeing actual dollars start to flow into the industry as a result of this renewed attention. We had corporate partners for the first time stepping up and saying, hey, we want to be a part of, this industry that's helping to address these major needs. Google, Twitter, Lowe's, Netflix, like all of those or types of entities, capital coming in, big federal funding resources flowing into CDFIs. And, I think it's hard to sort of draw a one-to-one, causal effect of because of the media attention, but it very, very much helped to have, CDFIs and our institutions and our organizations being quoted, being highlighted in these major news outlets, and, again, being presented as a solution and a way that we can help solve these problems. And so that, I think has really changed the trajectory of the CDFI industry and has kind of brought us to where we are now in 2024.
I think there's another story that'll be of interest to folks who may assume that when you get a celebrity involved, that's always a positive thing. But I believe there was a story around Johnny Depp that Lisa, I'll turn that to you to explain a little bit of nuance there.
Sure. So, in addition to the Community Reinvestment Act, which Dafina talked about, that's a kind of core regulation that affects our industry. Our industry has a key certification, so a certified community development financial institution. And that certification and what was required to be certified was established 3+ decades ago and had never been revised and updated to, again, reflect the current financial landscape, et cetera. And so Dafina and her team were heavily involved in comment letters and inputs. There were multiple rounds of input on what should certification look like. And early on in that process, we were contacted by a reporter at Barron's who was kind of following that. And Dafina took an interview. I prepped her on that. We took that interview, and so we got on this reporter's radar around that topic. It was, it was a good story. We got good quoted in it a way that we were pleased with, and then things kind of go on, and the certification is ready to be announced, and the same reporter starts digging into certification and finds that Johnny Depp got a mortgage from a CDFI based in California for a home. And that was the lead of the story, even though it was really about the CDFI in California, and there was a lawsuit about whether they were actually living up to their certification and their role as in community development finance. And so you can imagine that the idea that Johnny Depp is a disadvantaged person who needs a special loan was a bit, was gotcha-ish journalism. Now, we didn't respond to that because it was a bad actor, and part of our whole argument around certification was there are some bad actors, including during the Paycheck Protection Program. Some of them came out, but by and large, this is a responsible, mission-driven, very dedicated, effective industry, lending according to our mission. So we didn't feel a need to weigh into that, but we knew that that was on this reporter's radar. And so last year when we had our annual conference coming up, I reached out to him and I invited him under the pretext of, look, you've been talking about some outliers. Here's the biggest industry conference coming together. These are the people who are walking the talk. If you want to get exposure to a lot of different CDFIs that aren't lending to Johnny Depp for a mortgage, please come. And he took us up on that invitation, and we were able to meet him in person, talk to him about what sessions he was interested. This can lead us into a conversation about relationship building with reporters. But he took an interview on background with one of our partners at one of the banks. And I sat in on that conversation, and it really gave him more context to his story to focus beyond who he was going after. This reporter is now on our list. We're going to reach out to him when we have a story that's relevant to him. And we've continued to, CDFIs have continued to be in some of his stories. So when you're doing media, a lot of times, Dafina's talked about a couple of circumstances in the world that were global economic circumstances that brought a lot of attention to us. A lot of times the media is a longer game, and you're really thinking about building a relationship over time, right? Dafina did one interview on one small-ish story about certification. Okay, now we have a relationship with this person. Let's keep that going, and let's read his stories, maybe shoot him an email to say, hey, we saw your story on X. That was really great. Did you consider this? That ongoing touch point with a reporter, so that when you have big news, when you have a story you want to place, you have a relationship with that person. And I recommend for folks on the call to really think about your few target publications that you would like to get to start getting traction. Don't aim for top tier. Just don't. It's not, you'll just be beating your head against a wall, but find the industry trade publications. Is there even a well-read community publication, independent, even a free publication that covers a major city or something? Find those few, find the people who might be attracted to your story and start reading their work, start commenting on it, find whatever social media platform they're on. Reporters used to be very active on X/Twitter, less so now, but still, if you have a reporter in mind, find what channel they use, comment on their stuff, find out if they like a certain sports team so that maybe that could be your lead in to an email when you want to bring somebody to their attention. If their favorite team won the night before, you can reference that. Reporters are humans. They have egos. So if you compliment their stories, everyone likes to be complimented on their work. They have other interests beyond what they cover. So relate to them as a human. I think the worst thing you can do that doesn't work anymore, and it used to, is just a very canned PR pitch with, a canned quote or statement or a very overly massaged sentence describing it. Write them an email, talk to them, tell them, hey, you might be interested in this. I think you really need to think about personal relationships as you cultivate a media strategy and try to get some traction. And to start small and start focused. Blasting big is not going to get you very far.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that reminder to folks and folks who are new that this, approaching media as people. And I think it's an interesting time that we live in where a lot of social media, there's a lot of things that kind of depersonalize, and we forget there is a person behind all those stories. And where there's a story that doesn't tell the full picture, I think it's understandable in this situation. You have a Johnny Depp, you think, oh, that's going to get me the clicks, that's going to get me the eyeballs. And so to take the person in and say, okay, if you're covering this story, here's covering this topic, here's the bigger picture. And there's a lot of challenges. I mean, we talk about, if it bleeds, it leads, and all the things, that
Yeah.
the bad news is what gets a lot of attention. So getting folks to see a fuller story, looking at the solutions instead. And I'm curious if you can comment on, I know there's a lot of really good news stories within your network. How do you see those on the local level and beyond?
Yeah, we get a lot of inquiry. I wouldn't say a lot. We get a fair number of inquiries that are looking for specific on the ground stories, right? So OFN, we are a network, we are an intermediary. So we aren't doing the lending to the small business in X community, right? To start their dream business. So, and reporters want those stories. And so oftentimes they want an example of some sort of, we had once a request about predatory loans. Somebody for USA Today, I think, was covering predatory loans. And so keeping the open channels of communications with our members to know who's got those stories. This is another example of cross collaboration where we rely on our membership team who knows our members so well. Oh, this CDFI has a program on, that tries to get people out of predatory loans. So we really rely on, Dafina's team for those subtleties of background of policy where there's a risk that the comms team might not see because we're going to blast something out. And Dafina's like, you can't do that for X, Y, and Z. Okay, great. Glad I asked you. But the membership team to really have those on the ground stories. And we're always happy when we get a reporter to reach out to us to comment where we can at a broad national level and then direct them to our members. Oh, you should talk to this person about their specific story. It gets them closer to the on the ground work. And it's also relationship building with a reporter because you help them out. I could only speak this very broadly to the questions that you asked me, but here are 3 people you could talk to. One in Texas, one in Mississippi, one in, some other part of the country, and you can fill out your story.
And I want to add also that, it helps us to be able to identify people that we know are good spokespeople within our network. So, you kind of get a sense of like who, not only who's working on this issue and who has a program, but who is actually going to kind of deliver in an interview. And it's very similar to the way we also approach our policy work on the Hill, which is, okay, we know that this member of Congress is really interested in learning more about predatory lending. Who's working on it? Who's going to be a good spokesperson? Who can we connect them to that's going to be able to make that tie to what's happening in the district and the ground? It's great to talk to OFN, but we're a national network. We're a little bit removed from it. We're an intermediary. It's better to have someone who has direct on the ground experience kind of speaking to some of this stuff in many circumstances. There are some times where for like global things like CDFI certification that impact the whole industry, we probably are a really good spokesperson for that. But a lot of the times we do actually like to point to our members who can really drive home that messaging. And we really do have to kind of have a list in our heads of like who's going to be able to deliver and who's going to carry the message well.
Yeah.
And making sure that you, not only that they can carry the message well, but, before you send a reporter to them, you've talked to that person and know they're going to respond. Because the last thing you want to do is kill your relationship with the reporter because you sent them 3 people who didn't respond to their request. Got to keep it.
So many good examples of the collaboration and relationship building and clear communication. And I think this is actually a perfect segue into a question we have here from Emily about how can program team members, people not directly involved with media or communications work, best support the media and communications colleagues in their goals? Thank you, Emily, for that question. I'd love to hear from you both. How do people outside of your direct teams best support you?
You go
want to
first.
start? Yeah. Okay. For me, it's really ongoing communication about progress. And one of the things I've encountered in a whole career in nonprofits is the program teams think that the news has to be big or we aren't ready to say something about that yet. But there could be a very small piece of progress or learning that could have a hook, and you never know if you're not thinking in terms of media hooks. And we don't know, but we don't know about those things. So you need to keep the communication going. So over communicate what your progress is. Share things that you read. I saw this story that kind of aligns with what we're doing here. It could be a reporter who's not on our radar, and then it's somebody that we start following. So if your programs folks are, reasonably well read and literate in the media and they see things, like point them our way so that we can add folks to our list of followers. I will say, in terms of collaboration, something that we've implemented at OFN in the last 6 months is an embed model. So we have a communications team member embedded in every other team and attends their regular meetings, or like an honorary member of that team. They attend their regular team meetings as much as is practical and can listen for a news peg, something that's coming down the pike that we might take advantage of, can advise, can build that relationship. And, Dafina's and my teams were already working well together, but having that embed who's a really solid go-between is really great. So that's another approach you could take with program teams is making sure there's a comms person in most of your meetings, is part of your team's conversations.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything Lisa said. Like just making sure that you're really leveraging the expertise of your communications team and sharing things with them. They're going to see things that in a different way, or that you might not see, things that you might not think are important, could be the hook, right, that gets a reporter or someone interested. So again, just making sure that everyone's kind of has access to information. The other thing I think the programs teams can bring to the comms team is data, impact stories and data, right? Like, so always give us more information, give us more data, help us help you tell the story. And I think having the embed model, what it really has done for us is take some of the pressure off of the rest of the teams to be thinking about how does this work from a communication standpoint, or what do we do with this? You have someone who is helping you think through, ways to leverage all the work that you're doing. And it really does help because the communications team gets to build their subject matter expertise and, get a little deeper into the weeds on all the other things that are going on in the organization. And then we're also getting the benefit of learning more about what it takes to actually build a campaign or what that strategy looks like. And I say you also have deeper respect for the amount of work that goes into the comm side. Like, I go to a previous point, like you don't often see the comms team getting the credit they deserve for how hard this is, because you can be pitching and working on something and maybe nothing will come of it for 6 months or a year, but then all of a sudden, something pops, and it's because they've been laying the groundwork for all of those, many months, potentially years. And that stuff is not always visible or like celebrated in the way that, it probably should be.
I appreciate that. It takes me back to filmmaking days where I think audio is the quintessential example of this, where if you're doing your job really well, it flows over people and nobody even notices. It's when something off or goes wrong that suddenly, your role is visible. So really appreciate that. We're getting some great questions coming in. I think let's go to, we have a question. Is it expected that the media landscape will ever become easier again? Or is there no turning back? I'm curious what either of you, that's a big one.
The media loves crystal balling, but I don't love crystal balling for myself. So yeah, to crystal ball about the media to the media. I don't know. I mean, now we're throwing AI into the mix. We've got AI generated video, which is going to be a huge I mean, it already has been. Deep fakes are already a threat to what we're doing. I think it's going to be iterative and something that we're continuing to just have to navigate. I don't think it's ever going to get back to something that it used to be.
And one thing I think is really interesting is how different like generations consume media.
Yeah.
And thinking about how, like TikTok, you wouldn't have thought that that would be a place where people are going to potentially get their news, but it kind of is now. And so what does that mean? Particularly in, workplaces that have multi-generational kind of leadership. And, I think it could be hard to kind of get an organization to pivot to look at some of these new types of media or new ways of communicating information out, when you've sort of been like, well, we got to get an op-ed in the Hill and that's the only way we're going to be able to communicate. It's like, well, actually that's probably not true. You could get something placed in a local newspaper and just email it to the staffers and they're still going to get the same information as an op-ed on the Hill would have provided.
Yeah.
So just thinking about how to leverage the changes and in media, there might be more opportunities because some of these platforms or some of these ways of like getting information out don't require as much of a heavy lift as like getting someone in Politico to like give you an interview and write a print story.
Yeah. No, go ahead, Lisa.
I mean, exactly. I mean, you alluded, Piper, to the Peso model, right? And so just what Dafina is talking about is taking advantage of other channels and integrating them and not relying simply on that Politico reporter to get that person's attention, that you've got your paid channels, right? So the sponsored content that I talked about, digital ads, digital marketing, your earned, which is what we're talking about here, right? External earned media, shared, that's all the social channels. And then owned, this is your website, your blog, any other, you set up a Medium site, whatever, where you are owning those channels. And then, like Dafina said, you can point back to that piece of content. You can put a statement about CRA on your website, and you have a media channel that you can leverage to point folks back to. And Dafina made a very good point about generational changes and how people consume news. We always say in comms, there's no such thing as general public, and that's true. You're trying to reach an audience segment, and it's more deeply segmented than ever, and a very specific, if you're trying to reach somebody, you need to know who you're trying to reach, because that's going to tell you where it's supposed to be, what it's supposed to look like, who your spokesperson is, influencer campaigns, et cetera. It's just deeply, deeply segmented, not just by demographics, but then by what is the platform that they're on.
Yeah, no, and I hear you on not crystal balling, and yet I feel fairly certain that we're not going to go back to the days of three major networks. I think all the
Yeah.
more recent, the best practices we know in advocacy communication, really knowing where people are that you're trying to reach, and then using the platforms and the ways to reach them at the right time. I think fair to say it's never been more important. I try to avoid saying always and never, but maybe I can get away with it in
Mm-hmm.
this case. But I want to also, I mean, I think you alluded to things that you can and can't control in media. And I'm wondering if there's more that we should add there for folks as they're considering their media strategy.
You can't control the news cycle outside of what you are planning. You can make the best plans. I'm on a lot of lists, and this week, gosh, what is time anymore? And it was just last Sunday. People sharing on listservs. I feel for anybody who was trying to break news this week, because after Sunday,
Yeah.
what are you going to do? You can't, you can plan the best campaign to roll out and launch, and you can't control external events and how, the news cycle completely changes. You can, of course, you can news jack. So you can find a way to find a hook in that breaking news that aligns with your story and piggyback on that. Lots of brands do that on Twitter, et cetera. Things are happening, in, in popular culture, something happens and you pivot on that to get your brand message out. Um, but you can't control that. You have some control over what is written. I mean, people can do corrections. They can ask for corrections. A lot of folks who aren't on the media team, but who are the expert who's talking to the media, sometimes have an expectation that they can approve things or review things. It's almost never possible. Sometimes you'll get a tiny little excerpt. Is this accurate? And you can say that. You can ask if something's straight up wrong. Most reporters, they want to fix their mistakes. They want to change it. So you can control factual mistakes. If you wish they hadn't quoted X thing that you said, no, you can't control that. I also want to emphasize something I said earlier, which is you can control the conversation. If you are, again, television is a little bit different, especially live television, but when you're in a print conversation, you are in the driver's seat. You don't have to answer questions. Don't say no comment, but you can pivot any question. You've all watched an interview on TV and seen this happen, where someone asks a question and the person answers a different question. Sometimes it's annoying, but if you have a point you want to make and you want to avoid a question, just find some bridging language, we call it. Well, I can't speak to that, but what I can say is this, and you make your point again. So you can control how a media conversation goes. So those are a few things.
Yeah, the emotional support that you get from the from the communications team when you're preparing for an interview, because I'm one of those people that I'm really anxious. I don't really like talking to reporters. It's like, I'm always like, oh God, do I have to do this? And, we have a comms team that really works hard to make sure you're comfortable and prepared to do well, to succeed in the interview. And that includes, briefing documents ahead of time, key talking points, and also just like a quick call before and just saying, okay, here's the key messages. If they get sidetracked, just keep going back to our three key messaging points. And then also just hearing like, you're in control. They want to talk to you because you've got some kind of expertise in whatever this is. So like, don't go into this feeling scared or worried, like, but it is helpful to have someone kind of backing up. So sitting on the call is like, hey, if this starts going off the rails, you can kind of jump in and say, well, why don't we get focused back in on X or whatever it is. But it really does help to have the comms team kind of have your back in those situations, because as the subject matter expert, like we're just doing our thing, we're doing our work. This isn't really our space, and it can be really intimidating. So having someone who is more experienced with how it's supposed to go is extremely valuable. So I'm always grateful to have their support when I do have to do interviews.
No, really appreciate that. I mean, a lot of communications is the support is also that interpersonal, making sure you feel comfortable and ready to share a message in a really effective way. And I'm reminded sometimes of the Jerry Maguire, like help us, help you, so being open to that support.
Yes,
Kudos
yes.
for that.
Put that on my desk. Help us help you.
And I can't believe, I mean, to your point, Lisa, about, what is time anymore? Our hour has absolutely flown by, but I'd love to include another question that we got here. What advice would you give to someone starting out in their media relations career?
Oh, I'm going to give a very specific plug. I recommend that you follow Michael Smart. Sign up for his free newsletter. If you can afford to join for about 1,200 a year, his inner circle, where you get access to various webinars and live conversations. The amount of detail you get about strategy, about here's the subject line, here's how I responded to this reporter's email, here's how the PR person responded to this. It's very granular and it's full of tips. He's really great. So start there, and he'll probably lead you on some other paths. So I'll let him know that I plugged him, but big plug for Michael Smart.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add there. I think that's squarely in Lisa's camp.
Also, read all the news that you can, right? You
Yeah.
can't engage with the media if you don't understand them and what they cover and what they care about and how they're framing issues and how you might want them to reframe an issue.
Yep. Yep. We've covered a lot, and I'm curious if there is just one thing, and this feels like an impossible question, but I'll ask it anyway. One thing that you'd like for folks to remember from our conversation today.
I feel like we've come back a lot to the importance of good trust and working relationships between colleagues in your organization. So, trust that your comms team is going to steer you in the right direction and staff you appropriately, and block any sort of like if a reporter that's trying to write some kind of gotcha story, like trust people's expertise to deliver on the jobs they're doing in the organization. And if I know that the comms team is on it with as far as strategy, as far as who we're talking to and why, like I can deliver the content, the subject matter expertise, the policy lens, all of that stuff. So it's just really important that you have those really tight, good working relationships, where you trust each other to actually deliver on your jobs.
Oh, this is so lame, but I was going to say the same thing that Dafina said. Trust your colleagues' expertise and understand that we all have different relationships. And the more that we collaborate, the more we ensure that those relationships are preserved and maximized, and keep each other out of trouble, help each other move the needle forward. It's really important. And, Dafina and I on our teams, we're weaving our way through. We work together well. We learn when we don't work together well what happens. So, but I encourage folks to bring these two teams together.
I think that's a beautiful way to end. You're so in sync that you have the same takeaway point. I think that's really a credit to show just how well you're working. You've definitely broken down those silos and working together for the sake of your organization and the entire network and all the people whose lives your work is changing. So thank you for joining us today. And I think everybody who's on the call, I invite you to stay looped in with Stories Change Power on LinkedIn. This is an ongoing series. Next month, we'll be talking about correcting political misperceptions with a new organization called More Like Us. So encourage you to join us. Another really easy conversation that will, solve everything in an hour, or just skim the surface and give you more food for thought. When you leave the webinar today, a poll will pop up. Please be a hero for us. Take a few minutes, what am I saying? 15 seconds or so, a couple seconds to complete that poll. We really value your input. Be well, everyone. Do good and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.